but it was kind of this slow lull towards things that all of a sudden I realized like I didn't want to be watching this. And I just remember feeling so much shame inside and feeling
Yeah.
terrible about myself and feeling like, this wasn't something I'd wanted to ever experiment with or seek out. How am I struggling with this? And I think at that point it had started to become habitual. And I realized like I'm having trouble stopping on my own. And I think that was like a scary moment that compounded all that shame and made me feel even worse.
Yeah.
And it just sucked. I know so many people feel that sense of isolation.
Well, hey, Chandler, thanks for joining us today. I'm excited to share with our listeners a little bit more about Relay and the awesome resource that you've created there. But first, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of your personal experience that led you to create this?
Yeah, for sure. Well, thanks so much for having me on, by the way. I know like when I first started struggling, I wish that I knew about resources like Fight the New Drug, because for so long I felt alone. And the story for
Yeah.
me goes back to my high school days. I was exposed maybe later than some people that I've talked with. I think I was 14 at the time, maybe 13, just coming into high school. And I guess like for context, like I grew up in a home where I was the oldest of five, and I always felt kind of this inner desire to be a good person and to succeed in different areas of life. And so whether it was school or sports or anything else, I always felt like I could set my mind on something and I could do it. And
Yeah.
like usually with relative ease, like I mean, school wasn't that hard.
Yeah.
In the public school that I was going to, it was like, okay, like I can master what I set my mind to. And I was a hardworking kid. I generally tried to be good. And I remember we actually did have conversations in our household about pornography and about the potential dangers and harm around pornography. And so it was somewhat of an open conversation, but I don't think I necessarily felt like, it was still like an easy thing to talk about, or that it was like a, super easy thing that I could approach my parents about if it were a
Yeah.
struggle. And so when I was first exposed, I don't think I really realized like what, like the connecting of the dots of like what we had talked about and what was kind of happening. Like Instagram was
Yeah.
kind of new at the time. And I remember being on social media, like it was kind of this gradual approach. I didn't just, jump into anything, crazy, but it was kind of this slow lull towards things that all of a sudden I realized like I didn't want to be watching this. And I just remember feeling so much shame inside and feeling
Yeah.
terrible about myself and feeling like, this wasn't something I'd wanted to ever experiment with or seek out. How am I struggling with this? And I think at that point it had started to become habitual. And I realized like I'm having trouble stopping on my own. And I think that was like a scary moment that compounded all that shame and made me feel even worse.
Yeah.
And it just sucked. I know so many people feel that sense of isolation. The journey from there, I don't know how it happened, but I think my mom one day kind of felt nudged, like she needed to just check in on the topic and ask, like, had it been something I had been exposed to or dealing with, and for some reason, I guess maybe because of those conversations growing up, like I felt comfortable enough to be honest and say, like, for the last, I think maybe year or so at that point, I'd been struggling with it. And so I told her, and I just remember her being like really sad, like feeling like she'd failed as a
Mm.
parent. And I almost felt the sense of like obligation to help her feel like it wasn't, her fault. But at the
Yeah.
same time, dealing with this kind of mindset of shame that I had built up and trying to not make it like I was a failure, but that's how I felt. I ended up taking her advice. Like she, I guess, did some research after that conversation and found a local group-based program for like adolescent, young adult boys, and basically like led by a therapist to get some basic training and help. And I think by that point I'd realized now over the course of a few years in high school without being really successful that I like didn't have, the willpower, or that willpower alone, wasn't gonna
Sure.
work. And I thought that it was, because it was for anything else in life, and this wasn't. And that's kind of the chapter that changed a lot of things for me, is finally finding other people who are in the same boat. Which ends up connecting to the story of why I'm working on Relay now as my full-time job and why we started that. because of those early, I guess, experiences I had teaming up with other people to know that I wasn't
Yeah.
alone, but also to figure out how to work with other people towards the same goal rather than try to do it alone, even if I knew that I wasn't.
Well, your story obviously is so common. Like so many people go through what you went through as a young person, but I do think fewer people have the experience of having a parent approach them in a way that is as kind of open. Do you think that like had your mom responded any differently, that it would have changed the trajectory of your recovery?
I think even though I felt like I could be open with her, I didn't necessarily have the mindset that like I should involve her in my support system as
Yeah.
the only person in my support system, to be frank, at the time. If she had responded differently, like if she had been maybe more upset, like I don't think it was necessarily the most healthy thing that she kind of pointed all the blame on her, but I think it
Yeah,
was better than her, getting upset with me, certainly. I think
absolutely.
she realized that like, this wasn't defining my son. And although I think she slipped into the mindset of like, maybe this defines me as a parent, which I know she's worked through and realized that that's not true.
Yeah.
Um, I think the way that she did try to respond with compassion and even just trying to be helpful, like when she brought up the group-based program, she didn't try to force it on me, but she was, um, trying to help do some of her own research and just make suggestions and kind of leave it on the table for me to think about. I know everyone's different. I know I had come to the realization though, myself that like I did want to do something about it and that the status quo
Yeah.
wasn't working. And so I think, even if someone doesn't have a parent in that situation, I think the willingness to accept, like, it may be totally, totally normal for most people to need some sort of resource to get help changing because there's a
Yeah.
lot of neuropsychology and things that make this so addictive and tough to break.
Yeah.
And that's okay. Like, it's not necessarily our fault. If you're feeling trapped and you want
Absolutely.
to get out, it's certainly not helpful to point the sword at yourself.
Yeah, well said. And I think, I mean, a huge part of recovery for so many people is understanding, the role that shame plays in keeping us stuck so much of the time in the things that we're struggling with. So, can you talk a little bit about like what your journey with recovery and kind of, releasing that shame was like for you?
Well, I think where it started to change was really from the first meeting that I ended up attending. And I think it was helpful that I was with other people who were roughly my same age. Like I think I was 17 at the time. It was anywhere from maybe like 16 to 25. And so I think like the approachability of something that, it wasn't like walking into the basement of a church with a bunch of like old dudes that like, it didn't, whatever idea I had in my mind of like a group, it actually felt a lot different. And so I think just even the first impression of seeing these other, 8, 10 guys who, seemed pretty normal actually. It seemed like they had lives and goals and ambitions for who they wanted to be. And I realized like the narrative I'd been telling myself really probably was I'm a failure and only people who struggle with this, they must be failures if I can't get over
Yeah.
this. And realizing as I looked at others, well, I wouldn't say they're failures. Like that would certainly be way too harsh and definitely not true. And so I realized that that narrative I was telling myself that was rooted in shame wasn't true. And I think for a lot of people, it can be really difficult to untangle that just like looking within yourself alone. And I think it can be helpful to like hear other people's stories and associate with other people who are in the same boat at varying stages of recovery to realize like there are, people all over the world struggling with this same issue and different issues. And it's part of the human experience, I think, to learn how to deal with the stressors of life without turning and coping with behaviors that are unhealthy. And it's okay if for a time we're still learning how to figure that out. Like these are tough life skills that isn't just about porn. It's about how to deal with life better and to not need porn to do that. And so I think seeing other people start to tell their stories helped me start to untangle my own false narrative.
So often we forget when we're struggling with things, we internalize and we isolate. And I think it's so important to have support, especially to be able to go through that recovery process with other people. So obviously, that's part of the reason that Relay is such a great resource. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about what Relay is?
Yeah, and maybe to get there, I'll just close off the story and how it came full circle.
Yes,
My
please.
personal story. I made some progress through that group experience as I left high school and eventually came to college, moved here to Utah, where I am right now. And I remember like coming to college, like had some setbacks again, and like realized like, okay, I can't just view this as like a one time, like, put in some effort for a few weeks or a few months and then it's like gone for good. I need to like figure out how to implement a sustainable system. And so I found a group here locally and was able to start, I guess, getting back into having a support system with other guys who were, also going to college and like at varying stages of their recovery. For some of them, it was the first time. For me, it was kind of like my second, time around. And I think like through that experience, I remembered from my high school days that the power that I found in that first group was really by utilizing the other guys in the group and figuring out how to help each other, I guess, recognize those unhealthy beliefs that we were telling ourselves, the lies that we were telling ourselves, to help hold each other accountable in a way that wasn't shameful, but still like helpful to actually implement
Yeah.
changes and really just forming deep connection. And so I remember experimenting. This was near the beginning of my college days with this new group and trying to find ways that we could better utilize each other outside of those meetings. Because we were meeting on, I think, Tuesday nights or Thursday nights, once a week. And I remember we would come back to group and someone would always talk about like, I was really struggling the other day and, I hadn't been doing the goals that I talked about last week. And I ultimately like slipped up and we were like, man, like, why didn't you pick up the phone and call one of us? Like we would have totally been there for you. And also like, we didn't know that you weren't, you were kind of slacking leading up to that. So it's not that it was your fault. Right. But it's like, we could have helped maybe hold each other accountable to our game plans.
Right.
We were working on with our therapist in that setting. And just repeatedly tried various things, group chats and other methods of like holding each other accountable and helping implement this program outside of the meetings. And it always continued to regress back to like not really working, like us not really staying a team 7 days a week. It was just like 1 hour a week on Tuesday nights.
Yeah. And why do you think that was so difficult?
That's a good question. I mean, I think in the traditional structure of group-based recovery, it is like most common to have, once a week, I go to a meeting in person or on Zoom, and then I, find some takeaways, hopefully, learn some things, and identify what I want to do the rest of the week until we meet again. And I think by nature of being human, what that looks like is now I'm just, me back alone in my apartment or my home, living my normal
Right.
life solo, and I don't see those guys. And, we're not necessarily best friends. So it's not like I'm naturally hanging out with them anyways, even if we do have a good relationship. And so I think the natural human tendency is to go back into isolation where it's more comfortable to, go at my own pace and
Yeah.
like, maybe it's not even intentionally slacking or taking it easy, but not having to operate in that shared group context is easier and it's harder to do
Yeah.
with other people. But isolation is what breeds shame, and isolation is often what leads us into whether it's behavioral patterns or thought patterns that can keep us stuck. And so I think it was just kind of the natural tendency. And I think we only thought about the group when it was too late. Like it's like I'm about to slip up, maybe I'll reach out, but there's already so much, I guess, like going on in the brain at that point that realistically it's too late. It should have been caught a lot earlier, but we didn't have good systems in place using like GroupMe or WhatsApp
Right.
to make that happen. And I had no idea looking at the GroupMe if Nathan, just a random name that I'm making up, if Nathan like had been doing his stuff that he said he would over the last few days. So I have no idea if I should check on him, unless I'm
Right.
super proactive, which the average person, that's unrealistic probably.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, we're there at school, me and a few friends, and we're in a computer science class. And I've been interested for a long time in technology. Ironically, technology is connected to this issue, but I think I always felt within me like, it's not technology's fault either. I think technology can be used for good. And so I was always interested in like whether starting a company or building an app or something. That in this class we had the opportunity to just pick any idea and go build an app. And so I talked to my friends and I kind of shared openly with them my story. And neither of them were struggling with it, but they had plenty of people in their life who they knew who were or had.
Sure.
And I told them, like, I think there's a major issue with people struggling alone who really do want to overcome porn. but feel like they're the only ones, or even if they know they're not the only ones, there's not good tools to make it easier and less awkward and more effective to team up with other people to be successful. And so that was kind of the early impetus for Relay was, what if we built it? What if we, didn't reinvent the wheel, but borrowed from a lot of things that we've seen work and try to build a tool that really focused on helping layer in the comprehensive support system that helps you do recovery smarter, because it's not smart to struggle alone, but it's hard, and it's the natural path, like I mentioned. And so that was why, we started to go and do this. We had so many people we talked with who were like, yeah, I would love to be better at, not being isolated, but it's hard. And so
Yeah.
we're like, let's go to the whiteboard and see what we can think of.
Yeah, which is so amazing because, everything you just said, those are all of the reasons that a lot of people stay stuck, right? Because it's really difficult to get support. So I think that you just went and created the place where people could get the support, but not just in the traditional once a week setting, but kind of in an ongoing format. And for any listeners who don't know what Relay really is and how it works, will you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, so Relay is really designed to be this digital first group-based program. So it's all in an app and it's meant to be integrated to your daily life. So it's not like I'm meeting once a week with my group. In fact, it's meant to be super approachable for the person like me who maybe was even more hesitant than I was to think about getting on a Zoom meeting or going in person, showing their face to start getting a group type of support. You don't have to show your face with Relay, and it's all kind of chat-based, facilitated group interaction so that you can stay anonymous and protect your privacy while also still opting into real connection. And so we, in the program, like there's kind of a personal training component where we still try to arm you with the knowledge and the curriculum and some of the tools that help, whether you're a newcomer or a veteran, help you build the right set of capabilities to manage addiction and to manage your recovery process in a way that's tailored to you. And then surrounding that, providing you this accessible group of people who are in the same boat as you. And we're able to match you with people based on your preferences, like, whatever you're specifically struggling with, age, if you prefer to be with other people who are religious or who aren't. We factor in all of those types of preferences and put you with 7, 8 other people. And people will say like they love Relay because it feels like an easier way to have that group-based support 7 days a week instead of just once a week. But it also is like, I can take 5 minutes here and go see how someone in my group is doing with the goals that they've been working on. So a common thing will be like coming in and seeing like, oh, so-and-so hasn't, completed their module for the day, or their accountability goals are slipping a little. I can proactively reach out because we've created a lens of transparency that doesn't require you to disclose anything like personal about you, but to still create kind of this shared recovery environment where people will come and check in with me sometimes. Like when I show people the app, I'll sometimes demo this feature where you check in for how you're feeling, and it helps you identify and regulate any trigger that you potentially are experiencing. And so I might, show people like if I'm feeling off, it helps me throw a red flag in the chat. And I've accidentally, done this when I'm just showing people the app and it throws a red flag, and I'll instantly get like 4 people either like respond and text me in the app and say like, "Hey man, you okay?" And I'm like, "Oh, I'm just, showing people the app because they know
Yeah.
that I was, one of the creators." And it's just a funny example though of people really want to not just get support, they want to give it too. And I think even looking at traditional models of recovery like AA, they have a really strong service oriented culture where they've embraced this idea of one of the best ways of sustaining progress and overcoming addiction is by turning outwards and helping other people. And you don't need to be like years and years sober to be able to do that. And I found that to be true for me. Like as I was, still working through things myself in college, I was starting Relay. It wasn't like I was 10 years, down the road. And
Right.
I think that was like this really powerful insight of how do we help make it easier for people to be there and support others, knowing that it will help them in their own journey. And so that's kind of the
Yeah.
experience that our program creates.
Which is amazing. And I mean, we hear all the time from people who are struggling and they think because they're struggling, they can't, speak out against porn's harms, or they can't rep the movement or join the movement. And it's like, who is better qualified than you to understand how porn can impact an individual, right? So I think it's really good to encourage people, even who are struggling, to be able to support and help others. I think that's such a smart way to integrate this tool. You did mention we've mentioned some differences between what Relay offers and traditional therapy, but is this meant to be something that supplements traditional therapies, or can you talk a little bit about your goals for that or thoughts on that?
Yeah. Originally, we designed it to be very flexible to someone that maybe was already working with a therapist or working through some sort of program where Relay could kind of layer in as this additional peer support and accountability platform. And so I'd say maybe a third of the couple thousand people that are currently using Relay fall into that bucket. And then the other, two-thirds of people, Relay is the main primary resource and program that they're using for their recovery. And for a lot of people, it's their first thing. And I kind of mentioned how like we've designed it to be very approachable and a great first place to start, coming out of the
Yeah.
natural fear of like, I know it's bad. I understand the harms now because Fight the New Drug puts out such great content to help me understand that. But like, I'm kind of, not ready to just like go all out there, and post on my
Yeah.
public social media of like, hey, I have a problem, but that's okay. Um,
Yeah.
and so really we're trying to make it to where the program is tailored to you. So like you come into our intake survey that doesn't require you to talk to anyone. You download the app, and as you go through it in the trial experience of the app, it'll help curate a plan where it's a personalized recovery plan for you, that involves the curriculum, it involves tools, that you can kind of configure that if you're working with a therapist, you can set it up with the things you're already kind of working on and it can supplement in that way. And if you don't have that, we've built it to be kind of a all-in-one solution that can help someone that wants that group-based approach, but still needs kind of the general training and curriculum and tools
Right.
to help.
And you partnered with clinicians to create the app, is that right?
Yeah, so
There's,
I had a lot of, clinicians that I had worked with over the years, and they were like some of the first people I bounced this idea off of. I was like,
yeah,
why isn't there more technology working in kind of the clinical context to help existing groups or individuals have some of these principles? And almost every clinician I talk to agrees that connection is super important. Having the right kind
yeah,
of accountability is important. It's often very hard to get that accountability with a spouse or someone in real life because there's this
yeah,
tricky relationship and you don't want to feel like a burden or let that create more shame for you. And so
yeah,
I think the early feedback we got from clinicians was like, yeah, I'll like, yeah, it sounds like what you're already thinking. If that existed in any shape in an app, yeah, like that would be great. Um,
yeah.
but as we've kind of gone along over the last couple of years, we've built out kind of a clinical advisory team that helps oversee like our content that we create in the curriculum and ensuring that the way that we structure groups is safe and makes sense.
And it can be really intimidating to find a therapist or clinician to work with. So I think being able to have that anonymity, as you talked about, but still get the accountability and the connection is such a big thing because that's so difficult to get in a lot of other settings. So you mentioned you're catering things to, personal characteristics, to kind of align these groups, which I think is great. Aside from pornography, I know there are other things you offer groups for. What are the options for someone who would want to sign up for this?
Yeah, so pornography has been our core focus since day one, and that's by far the most popular program we offer, the most built out. And the other programs are actually patterned very similarly. And it actually was funny because early on we had a lot of therapists referring people to us saying like, I want my client to use this in conjunction with the therapy they're receiving. But I've also got clients for eating disorders and for gambling and for substance abuse. Could we do groups for that too? And we took a look at the product and realized that there's not a whole lot about porn addiction that's very different than other addictions. There's, I guess, basically the core insight that I kind of came to just as a normal human being is like, it's just a crutch that I need to fix underlying things in my life. And that crutch can look different for anyone, but the way to address it is pretty similar. And so therapists were the ones to say, yeah, it's pretty similar. Could you start doing groups for eating disorders, et cetera? And so eating disorders, gambling, substance abuse, more recently, we've started forming some groups for that are the
Yeah.
main ones that we offer.
And do you have some groups for betrayal trauma as well? Is that something you've added?
We have tested that pretty extensively, and I would say like at the time of recording this episode, we're trying to figure out how that fits in because we from day one have wanted to support the betrayal trauma use case and people who have a loved one that is struggling and help them find
Yeah.
healing. And I think the way that we are trying to continue shifting the product, because we're still a pretty young company, is we want to really make sure we're nailing the kind of personalized smart recovery curriculum and group-based program, basically
Yeah.
for changing behavior, whether it's
Yeah.
pornography, eating disorder, gambling, whatever. And then we want to figure out, like, with any of those, there's people around them that there's
Yeah.
absolutely a betrayal or trauma in any sense that is present. And so we do currently have some groups in the app for betrayal trauma, but I would say probably a safer bet is to stay tuned. And it's something that we really care about and will likely add more resources for in the coming months and years.
You've talked a little bit about accountability and this being a way to keep people from isolating again, between once a week appointments. But can you talk a little bit about the importance of accountability for recovery from pornography specifically?
Yeah, I think for many of us, we might have definitions of what accountability means to us that may not be um, fully healthy or even comprehensive in what it could be in its best, purest sense. And what I mean by that, like for example, accountability as a kid to me, and my parents were great, but when they were holding me accountable to something, sometimes it didn't feel the nicest. And, as imperfect parents, like sometimes it didn't probably come off the best either. And so it could, sometimes create more shame, or like if I don't have the right type of accountability structure with a spouse, like it might actually not create the effect of accountability that helps me be more consistent at the inputs. And I guess maybe like I'll focus on that as maybe the definition and the importance of accountability is something that helps you put the work into the inputs, the things you can control, not necessarily the outcome. So it's less
Yeah.
about my wife, for example, kind of beating me over the head as an example, verbally, or just kind of getting upset if I slip up, but her caring a little bit more about, am I working my plan and the process,
Yeah.
the inputs that I can control, um, and the accountability centering on that, I think, is what I've seen to be where accountability tends to be more effective. And who you have as accountability partners, I think, does matter. I'm sure there's people that have researched this a lot more than I have, but just kind of observing throughout Relay, the number of people is really interesting. Having, a handful of people in addition to like one person, like in traditional AA, you have one sponsor, but kind of like different layers of maybe I have one main person plus this like Relay group plus a couple people in real life. So you have these different angles and dimensions that if you have chosen people who care about you and are aligned with kind of how recovery looks, and they are helping you focus on the inputs and not as much on the outcomes, I think it can be a really super important experience to help you stay on track. Because I think that's the risk of not having it is you start to measure yourself by the outcomes of like how many days have I been successful of not viewing pornography, and we forget to think about like measuring our game plan that helps hopefully create the kind of healing where
Yeah.
pornography is not a thing anymore.
Yeah, it's that proactive accountability as opposed to only being reactive and looking at the outcomes. I think that's great advice. For someone maybe struggling with pornography who you've been in their shoes, what is the best piece of advice you got in your recovery, or the best thing that you learned that has helped you in your journey that you would share with them?
Yeah, I might sound like I'm beating the dead horse a little bit with this theme of connection and teamwork, but I remember I think it was one of my therapists that kind of drilled it into our heads that we don't need to be perfect to be there for someone else. Like you said, to rep the movement, to be open about it, or to just find a way to be a helping hand to someone else who isn't doing well, or to someone who is doing well, and to cheer them on and to try to learn from them. Like I think when I started shifting my mindset to realize that if I could turn outwards to try to be a good teammate, and if I could do things to try to have a great support system around me, it made all the difference in my recovery. It wasn't just knowing I wasn't alone. It was now I was working in a place that wasn't isolated. I was working in a place that had transparency and healthy systems for accountability and connection. And so that, I think that's the message I would give people, is like, it doesn't matter really how long you've gone or you've been able to go in the past with pornography. You are worth so much right now. This does not define you. This doesn't define your worth. And you certainly, just as you are, have unique strengths and a unique personality that someone else might need to be their fellow support person, whether it's in a group setting or some other setting. You can be that type of person at any point in time in your journey.
Well, I'm excited for our listeners to check out Relay. We will have in the show notes some links to send people there and to learn more about how they can utilize that resource. But is there anything that we haven't covered that you want to share before we wrap up?
Yeah, I would just say, whether you've been on this journey for a while, you've been trying different solutions, or you currently are, working through different solutions, or this is your first kind of venture into thinking about getting help, just give it a try. I would say that there's so many good resources out there, actually, that I know Fight the New Drug has been able to compile a number of them. And I think I was so glad that I at least gave it a try and realized that I wasn't locking myself into anything by just taking the step and changing something about how I was trying to get help, and realizing that my current status quo wasn't going to really get me the kind of healing that I wanted. And quite frankly, having the respect for myself to say, even if it's a sacrifice of time and some money, I am going to care enough about myself to try to get help. I built Relay because I care so much about people not having to struggle alone like I did for so many years, and like so many other people I've talked to. So we've tried to design it to feel as approachable and safe and like personalized to what you need and want, that, you can check it out and go through the trial experience and see for yourself. If it's something you feel like is helpful, then great. And if it's not, I know that there's like a whole slew of other things that I would just advise that people think about figuring out what's going to be the right formula for you. Because I don't think you should give up on yourself just because the first thing that you've tried didn't work. It's worth continuing to keep going.
Well, thank you so much, Chandler, and thank you for sharing your story with us, and also for creating Relay. For our listeners, please go check out the show notes or the post descriptions wherever you're seeing this, and we'll be sure that you can access Relay through a link there.
Thanks for being willing to have me on, and appreciate so much all the work that you guys do. I remember when I first heard of Fight the New Drug, it was around the time that I started struggling, and it did give me that initial sense of like, I'm not alone, and there's an organization out there that is trying to help people, which is cool.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Consider Before Consuming. If you're interested in learning more about Relay, you can find them at ftnd.org/relay. Consider Before Consuming is brought to you by Fight the New Drug. Fight the New Drug is a non-religious and a non-legislative organization that exists to provide individuals the opportunity to make an informed decision regarding pornography by raising awareness on its harmful effects, using only science, facts, and personal accounts. Check out the episode notes for resources mentioned in this episode. If you find this podcast helpful, consider subscribing and leaving a review. Consider Before Consuming is made possible by listeners like you. If you'd like to support Consider Before Consuming, you can make a one-time or recurring donation of any amount at ftnd.org/support. That's ftnd.org/support. Thanks again for listening. We invite you to increase your self-awareness, look both ways, check your blind spots, and consider before consuming.